After my father's car accident, I inherited the entire estate and house, but my mother refused to accept it. She remarried, had new children, and tried to push me out of my own home. I was 15 when everything changed. My father's death was sudden, a car accident that left no room for goodbyes. One minute, he was on his way home from work. The next, he was gone. The shock of it all hit me like a freight train. I was in the middle of finals, struggling to concentrate while my mother, Hannah, oscillated between weeping and silent numbness. I tried to keep it together for both of us, but deep down, I was lost. Then came the day of the will reading. It was surreal, sitting in a lawyer's office while still processing my father's death. The lawyer, an older man with a weary face, cleared his throat and read through the legal formalities. I wasn't paying much attention until he got to the part about the inheritance. "Lucas," he said, pausing as if to brace himself, "your father has left the entire estate to you. The house, the savings, and all other assets are in your name." My jaw dropped. I had no idea what to say. I was just a kid, barely able to drive, let alone manage an estate. I looked over at my mother, expecting some kind of reaction, maybe even a reassuring word. But her face was blank, her eyes distant. When she finally spoke, her words were curt. "Are you sure there's no mistake?" she asked the lawyer, her voice tinged with disbelief. "No mistake," he replied. "Your husband's will is clear. Everything goes to Lucas." I wasn't sure what to think. Part of me was grateful for my father's trust, but a bigger part of me was overwhelmed. I didn't want the house. I wanted my dad back. But it was Hannah's reaction that stayed with me. Her initial shock quickly morphed into something colder, resentment, maybe even anger. I wasn't entirely sure why, but it felt as though she viewed my sudden inheritance as a betrayal, a blow to the life she had envisioned. In the days that followed, my mother grew distant. She barely spoke to me, spending more time locked in her room or on the phone with friends, discussing plans I wasn't a part of. It was strange being in the same house but feeling miles apart. I tried to reach out, but she brushed off my attempts. "We'll figure this out," she'd say in a clipped tone before changing the subject. A few months later, I overheard her on the phone with someone. "He's just a child," she said, her voice low but filled with irritation. How is he supposed to manage everything? It hit me then. She was angry because she felt sidelined, like the house and the inheritance were slipping through her fingers. The fact that my father had entrusted everything to me seemed like a decision she couldn't understand, let alone accept. Despite the awkward tension, I tried to focus on school and maintain some semblance of normalcy. I thought things might get better with time, that maybe Hannah would adjust. But I was wrong. Instead, her frustration only grew. I'd catch her staring at me with a mix of bitterness and something I couldn't quite decipher. It was as if she blamed me for my father's decision, as if I had taken something from her. Then, one evening, as I was doing homework in the kitchen, my mother dropped a bombshell. "I've met someone," she said abruptly, not bothering to look up from her phone. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her right. "Someone? You mean like a boyfriend?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She finally looked up, her expression indifferent. "Yes, his name is Mark. We've been seeing each other for a while now." I didn't know how to react. It had barely been a year since my father's death, and now my mother was talking about a new man like it was the most normal thing in the world. I felt a pang of betrayal, but tried to suppress it. "Oh," was all I managed to say. Over the next few weeks, Mark started showing up more often. He was friendly enough, but there was something off about him, an eagerness to assert himself that made me uneasy. He'd make comments about how the house could use some updates, or how I'd soon have siblings to share it with. The idea of sharing my father's home with strangers was unbearable, but my mother seemed unfazed. As Mark's presence grew, my mother's attitude toward me became even colder. She began hinting that it might be best to sell the house and start fresh. I resisted, reminding her that it was my house now. Her response was sharp. "You're too young to understand, Lucas. We need to think about what's best for everyone." I felt trapped, cornered in my own home. The house, once filled with memories of my father, was now a battleground. Mark and his kids were set to move in, and my mother was adamant that I needed to adjust. But I wasn't ready to give up the one part of my father that I had left. The first time I met Mark, it was awkward, to say the least. He showed up at the house one Saturday afternoon, just as I was getting used to having some peace after my father's death. Mark was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with a confidence that immediately made me uneasy. He had this way of talking that felt forced, like he was trying too hard to make a good impression. "Hey there, champ," he said, holding out a hand. I shook it reluctantly, trying not to show my irritation. It didn't take long for Mark to become a permanent fixture. Within months, he had proposed to my mother, and she eagerly accepted. I overheard the proposal happening in the living room. Mark's voice enthusiastic and my mother's response equally giddy. It felt like a betrayal. Just a year ago, my father had been sitting in that same living room. Now Mark was there, making plans for a future that didn't include him. Soon after the wedding, Mark and his 2 children, Josh and Leah, moved in. The house became crowded overnight. Josh was 12, loud, and always bouncing a basketball around the house despite my constant protests. Leah, at 10, was quieter but sneaky, constantly nosing around my room under the guise of getting to know her big brother. I couldn't stand it. Mark quickly tried to establish himself as the head of the household. He wasn't aggressive about it, at least not at first. He started with subtle things, like rearranging the furniture or moving my father's old tools from the garage to a storage shed without asking. He even suggested knocking down a wall to make the kitchen more open concept. The way he talked about changing the house made my skin crawl. "It'll make the place feel bigger," he said one evening during dinner, as if he owned the place. "What do you think, Lucas?" I bit back my frustration and replied flatly, "It's fine as it is." Hannah shot me a disapproving look, as if I was being difficult. "Lucas, we need to make this home work for everyone," she said in that patronizing tone that always made me feel small. "This is my home." I wanted to scream, but I kept my mouth shut. It wasn't just the renovations. Mark brought new rules into the house. He enforced strict curfews, tried to make family dinners mandatory, and even suggested that I call him Dad to make things easier for the younger kids. I refused, of course, which only seemed to make him more determined. "You need to adjust, Lucas," my mother would say. "This is how families work," but it didn't feel like a family. It felt like I was being replaced, as if Mark and his kids were erasing everything that had made this house ours. My father's chair, the one he'd always sat in to read the paper, was moved to the attic to make room for a newer, sleeker recliner that Mark brought in. My father's fishing gear, which he'd promised to teach me to use one day, was sold at a garage sale when I wasn't home. I found out later when I noticed the empty space in the garage. My mother's explanation? We needed the room for Mark's tools. The final straw came one weekend when I came home to find that Mark had painted over the mural my father had helped me make in the basement, a collection of drawings and silly doodles we had done when I was younger. I stood there, stunned, as I looked at the fresh coat of beige paint covering the memories. "What the hell, Mark?" I confronted him, unable to keep my anger in check. "That mural meant something to me." He shrugged, his expression completely indifferent. "It's just a wall, Lucas. We needed to make the basement more presentable." "It wasn't just a wall," I shot back. "It was a memory." But Hannah sided with Mark. "Lucas, stop being so dramatic," she snapped. "We need to make this house feel like home for everyone." The words stung. It felt like a punch to the gut, as if my feelings meant nothing in this new family dynamic. I couldn't understand how my mother had become so cold, so willing to erase everything my father and I had built. Things escalated when Mark started talking about selling the house altogether. "It's too big for just the 5 of us," he reasoned. "We could downsize, use the extra money for a fresh start." My mother nodded in agreement, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. For a moment, I thought she might stand up for me, but she just said, "It's something to consider, Lucas." It wasn't just something to consider. It was my last connection to my father, and they were trying to take it away. That night, I lay awake in my room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of my mother's new life unfolding down the hall. I felt like a stranger in my own home, surrounded by people who didn't care about my father's legacy or about me. I realized then that I had to be prepared to fight. This house was all I had left of the man who had meant everything to me, and I wasn't going to let them take it without a battle. The money issue came up gradually, like a storm building on the horizon. At first, it was subtle comments during dinner about how tough things were financially. Mark would casually drop hints, saying things like, "It's hard to manage everything with 3 growing kids," or "This house needs major repairs that we just can't afford." I knew what he was getting at, but I tried to ignore it, hoping it would blow over. One evening, as we all sat around the dinner table, Mark made his move. "You know, Lucas," he began, setting down his fork dramatically, "it would really make a difference if we could access some of the inheritance." I froze, barely able to process his audacity. The inheritance was my father's last gift to me, a security blanket he'd left behind to ensure I had a stable future. Now Mark wanted a piece of it. "I mean," he continued, "it's not like you need all that money right now. You're just a kid, and we could really use some of it to make this house better for everyone." Hannah jumped in, her voice almost pleading. He's right, Lucas. It's not fair for one person to have so much when we're all trying to build a new life together. Build a new life together? I repeated incredulously, dropping my fork onto my plate. This was supposed to be my life, my home, Dad's legacy. And now you want to take it from me? Lucas, it's not like that, my mother insisted. We're a family now, and families share. It's not about taking it from you. It's about helping everyone feel secure. Mark chimed in again, a bit more forcefully this time. We could use the money to pay off debts, make some much-needed renovations, and set up a college fund for Josh and Leah. The sheer entitlement of it made my blood boil. Josh and Leah? I retorted, struggling to keep my voice steady. What about my future? This was my father's hard-earned money, meant for me. Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. You don't need it all right now, Lucas. You're still a kid, and you'll have plenty of time to make your own money. My mother reached across the table, trying to take my hand, but I pulled away. Lucas, please, she said softly. This could bring us closer together. We're a family now, and families support each other. I shook my head, my voice breaking as I spoke. No, Mom, this isn't support. This is betrayal. Dad left that money for me, not for you to give to Mark. The room fell silent. I could see the anger simmering behind Mark's eyes, but he tried to mask it with a forced smile. We're just trying to do what's best for everyone, he said, but I could hear the frustration in his voice. The next few weeks were hell. The pressure from Mark and my mother didn't stop. They tried everything from guilt-tripping to subtle manipulation. Mark would make offhand comments about how selfishness only tears families apart, and my mother would give me long, tearful speeches about how I was ruining any chance of a happy home by being so stubborn. It was as if my own mother had joined forces with this stranger to gaslight me into giving up my father's legacy. One afternoon, I overheard a heated conversation between them in the living room. We need that money, Hannah, Mark whispered sharply, his voice laced with irritation. We can't keep living like this. Hannah's response was softer, almost desperate. I know, Mark, but he's not budging. I don't know what to do. I felt sick hearing them talk about me and my inheritance like I was just an obstacle in their plans. It was clear that their new, happy family didn't include any consideration for what I wanted or what my father would have wanted. The breaking point came one day when Mark cornered me in the kitchen while I was making a sandwich. He stood too close, trying to intimidate me with his presence. You know, Lucas, he said slowly, this whole thing could go a lot smoother if you weren't so stubborn. I didn't back down, meeting his gaze directly. And maybe things wouldn't be so tense if you weren't trying to steal what's mine. His eyes flashed with anger. Steal? That's a strong word, Lucas. We're just asking you to be reasonable. I gripped the counter, my knuckles turning white. No, Mark. You're asking me to give up the only thing my father left me. That's not reasonable. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. You're making this harder than it has to be, kid. We could all get along just fine if you just play ball. But I wasn't going to play ball. Not now, not ever. I had made up my mind. I was going to protect my father's legacy, even if it meant turning my back on my mother and Mark. I had spent enough time feeling like a stranger in my own home, and I wasn't going to let them take the last piece of my father away from me. Turning 18 felt like reaching the end of a grueling marathon. For the past 3 years, I had been living in a constant state of vigilance, always aware that I was one step away from losing everything my father had left me. But now, with legal adulthood approaching, I knew I was finally in a position to take control. I spent the months leading up to my birthday researching everything I needed to know about property laws and inheritance rights. I consulted with a lawyer discreetly, paying for the sessions with part-time jobs I'd taken on. It was a strange mix of relief and anxiety, knowing that I had a plan, but also understanding how fragile the situation was. If Mark and Hannah caught wind of my intentions before I was ready, they could make my life even more miserable. As my birthday drew closer, the pressure at home escalated to a boiling point. Mark started dropping not-so-subtle hints about how we needed to make a decision about the house soon. It's just too much space for us now, he'd say during dinner, glancing at Hannah for backup. Lucas, my mother would chime in, her voice adopting that faux gentle tone she used when she wanted something. Imagine a fresh start in a new place. Wouldn't that be nice? No more painful memories here, just a clean slate. But I wasn't interested in a clean slate. This house wasn't just a property. It was the last piece of my father's legacy. Moving would mean erasing everything he built, everything he stood for. And they didn't get that. They never would. Finally, my 18th birthday arrived. I woke up that morning with a strange mix of empowerment and dread. I was officially the owner of the house now, at least on paper, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. I decided it was time to have the conversation that I'd been dreading. I came home from school that day and found Mark in the living room, sipping a beer and watching TV. Hannah was in the kitchen, cooking dinner. I took a deep breath and called them both to the table. "What's up?" Mark asked, eyeing me suspiciously. Hannah's face brightened, probably expecting me to announce some sort of capitulation. "Is everything okay, honey?" I sat down and met their gazes head on. "I just wanted to let you both know that now that I'm 18, I'm taking full control of the house. It's not going to be sold, and I'm not moving anywhere." Mark's eyes narrowed, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. "Lucas, don't be ridiculous. You're just a kid. You can't manage this place on your own." I kept my voice steady, even though my heart was pounding. "I can and I will. I've spoken to a lawyer, and I know my rights." Hannah's expression shifted from confusion to frustration. "Lucas, why are you being so stubborn? We're just trying to make things easier for everyone." "No, you're trying to make things easier for yourselves," I shot back. "This house is all I have left of Dad, and I'm not giving it up." Mark slammed his hand on the table, his face turning red. "You think you're some kind of martyr, huh? Clinging to this house like it's going to bring your dad back." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't let it show. I took a deep breath and said, "No, I know he's not coming back. But I also know he wouldn't want me to just hand over everything he worked for." The silence that followed was suffocating. Hannah looked at me with a mix of anger and something that almost resembled pity. "Lucas, you're making a mistake," she said, her voice low and tight. "No, Mom," I replied firmly. "I'm finally doing something right." Over the next few days, things got even more tense. Mark began locking himself in his home office for hours at a time, while Hannah alternated between trying to guilt-trip me and giving me the silent treatment. It was clear they were regrouping, trying to figure out a new angle to force my hand. Then one evening, I overheard them talking in hushed voices after they thought I'd gone to bed. "We can't just let him keep the house," Mark whispered urgently. "We put too much into this. We have to figure out another way." Hannah replied, her voice barely audible. "Maybe we could convince him to sign something he doesn't understand." I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just about the money for them. It was about control, about winning. The next day, I took action. I changed the locks on the house and set up security cameras, small but effective measures to reinforce the fact that this was my house now. I also formally updated the deed to reflect my sole ownership, just to make sure there were no legal loopholes they could exploit. When they came home and found the locks changed, there was chaos. Mark banged on the door, demanding to be let in, while Hannah yelled my name, her voice filled with disbelief and anger. "What the hell, Lucas?" Mark shouted through the door. "You can't just lock us out." "Yes, I can," I replied calmly from the other side. "This is my house now, and until you start respecting that, things are going to be different." Hannah's voice broke. "Lucas, please, don't do this." But I was done being manipulated. "It's not up for discussion, Mom. Not anymore." The reality was harsh, but it was also liberating. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my life. Control that no one could take away from me. On the day I changed the locks, I knew there was no turning back. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, knowing I had finally asserted myself. I waited for the inevitable confrontation, pacing the living room, rehearsing the words I planned to say. The silence of the house was deafening, almost taunting me, as if it were aware of the battle that was about to erupt within its walls. When Mark and Hannah arrived that evening, I could hear the jangle of keys, followed by the sound of the front door refusing to budge. A pause. Then came the banging. "Lucas," my mother's voice shrieked, a mix of anger and disbelief. "What is this? Open the door right now." I took a deep breath, trying to calm the knot of anxiety in my chest. I walked to the door, unlocked it, and opened it just enough to meet their faces, both red with frustration. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Mark demanded, his eyes blazing. "This is my house," I said evenly, my hand still gripping the edge of the door. "And I'm not leaving." The words felt foreign in my mouth, stronger, bolder than I'd ever been with them before. I could see the shock register on my mother's face, quickly replaced by a look of betrayal. "Lucas," she said, her voice breaking, "you can't be serious. We're a family, are we?" I shot back, my own voice laced with bitterness. "Because it sure hasn't felt that way for a long time." Mark pushed forward, trying to wedge his way into the doorway, but I didn't budge. "Listen, you ungrateful little—" "Don't," I interrupted, meeting his glare head-on. This house is mine. Legally, there's nothing you can do. Hannah stepped in, her eyes desperate and pleading. Lucas, please. You can't just lock us out. We've put so much into this place. We're a family, and families share. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions crash over me. Anger, sorrow, and a deep-seated disappointment. But you never wanted to share, Mom. You wanted to take. All this time, you've tried to take everything Dad left for me and make it yours. Hannah's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears. For a moment, I almost faltered. I almost opened the door wider, almost let them back in. But then Mark's voice sliced through the moment like a blade. This isn't over, Lucas, he spat. You think you could just change the locks and kick us out? You'll regret this. I squared my shoulders, steeling myself against his threats. If you want to try something, Mark, go ahead. But you won't win. With that, I shut the door in their faces. I locked it and slid the deadbolt into place, hearing the heavy click resonate through the silent house. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened to their angry voices grow fainter outside, then finally dissipate. For the next few days, the atmosphere was tense but quiet. I stayed in the house, half expecting Mark and Hannah to storm back in with some legal trick up their sleeves. But they didn't return immediately. I spent the time trying to settle into this new reality. It was still my home, but it felt different now, like a battlefield I had just won. Then, one afternoon, I received a call from my lawyer. Lucas, I got a call from Mark's attorney, he said, sounding tired but unsurprised. They're filing a suit to contest your right to the property, claiming you're unfit to manage it alone. I felt a surge of anger, but also a grim determination. Let them try, I said. I'm not backing down. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, paperwork, and preparations for court. Mark and Hannah had made it clear they were willing to play dirty, using every argument they could think of, my age, my supposed lack of financial responsibility, and even my emotional state after my father's death, to try and prove I couldn't handle the inheritance. But my lawyer was prepared. We had all the necessary documentation to prove my legal right to the house, as well as testimonies from neighbors and family friends who knew the situation. They vouched for my maturity and my capability to manage my own affairs. I realized then how much support I had from people I hadn't expected. The court date finally arrived. Mark and Hannah sat across from me, their expressions a mix of confidence and anger. Hannah avoided eye contact, while Mark glared at me like I was a traitor. As their lawyer laid out the case, claiming that I was just a kid who couldn't possibly manage the property, I felt a surge of resolve. When it was my turn to speak, I took a deep breath and looked the judge straight in the eye. This house is more than just a property, I said. It's my father's legacy. He left it to me because he trusted me. I've done everything in my power to honor that trust, and I'm not going to let anyone take it from me. The judge seemed to consider my words carefully, then nodded. After a brief deliberation, she ruled in my favor. Mark's attempt to contest the inheritance was dismissed. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt a mix of triumph and exhaustion. I had won, but at what cost? I knew my relationship with my mother was probably beyond repair, and I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Hannah caught up with me outside, tears streaming down her face. Lucas, please. I never meant for it to come to this. I just wanted to make things work with Mark. I looked at her, feeling a hollow emptiness. You chose Mark over me, Mom. You made your choice. She broke down, sobbing into her hands. I felt a pang of sympathy, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Not this time. I walked away, leaving her behind. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was finally free from the constant manipulation and pressure. The house, my father's house, was truly mine now. But more than that, I had reclaimed my own life. I thought changing the locks and asserting my rights over the house would be the end of it. I was wrong. A few weeks after I stood my ground, I received a letter. It was from Mark's attorney, stating that he was officially contesting the will. The claim? I was too young and inexperienced to manage my inheritance responsibly. Mark argued that he, as my stepfather, was better suited to handle it. Pure manipulation, thinly disguised as concern. I felt a sick mixture of disbelief and anger. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about control, a final attempt by Mark to claim what wasn't his. The betrayal stung, but not as much as seeing my mother's name also listed as a party to the lawsuit. I hired a lawyer named Lisa, known for her toughness in handling estate cases. The first time I met with her, she asked me bluntly, "Are you ready for this? Because it's not going to be easy." I nodded. I am. I don't have a choice. Lisa didn't waste any time preparing our defense. She gathered all the necessary documentation: my father's original will, my birth certificate proving I was now of legal age, and financial records that showed I'd managed my trust fund responsibly so far. I had also built a solid support network over the years, consisting of neighbors, teachers, and family friends who knew about the situation. They were ready to testify on my behalf, vouching for my maturity and the legitimacy of my father's wishes. When the court date arrived, I was filled with a mix of anxiety and determination. Walking into that courtroom felt surreal, like stepping into a movie scene I never wanted to be a part of. Mark and Hannah were already there, sitting side by side. Mark's expression was cold, while my mother's face was an unreadable mask. I tried to meet her eyes, but she looked away. The proceedings began with Mark's lawyer making his case. He painted me as a reckless teenager who couldn't possibly understand the magnitude of managing such assets. He argued that Mark had been providing for me since he entered my life, and that allowing me to control the estate would be detrimental to my well-being. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting to keep my composure. The audacity of it all was infuriating. Then it was Lisa's turn. She stood up, calm and collected. "Your Honor," she began, "what we have here is a clear attempt to undermine the legal wishes of Mr. Lucas's father. The will explicitly states that all assets are to be transferred to Lucas upon reaching adulthood. My client has not only reached that age, but has also demonstrated responsible management of the trust left in his name. Any claims suggesting otherwise are baseless." She presented our evidence methodically, never missing a beat. The will, the birth certificate, financial statements, it was all laid out clearly. I could see Mark shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Meanwhile, my mother kept her gaze fixed on the floor. When Lisa called one of my former teachers as a witness, she spoke about how I had always been determined, focused, and resilient, qualities that, she argued, were exactly what my father had likely seen in me when he made the decision to leave everything in my care. By the time it was my turn to speak, my nerves had settled. I looked directly at the judge and spoke from the heart. This house, and everything my father left behind, is more than just property to me. It's his legacy. He trusted me to carry it forward, and that's what I intend to do. I've worked hard to honor his wishes, and I'm prepared to keep doing so. I won't let anyone take that away. The courtroom was silent for a moment. I glanced over at my mother, but she remained stoic. After what felt like an eternity, the judge delivered her decision. "The will is clear and legally binding," she stated firmly. "There is no evidence to suggest that Lucas is incapable of managing the estate. The case is dismissed." Relief washed over me, but it was bittersweet. I had won the battle, but the war with my mother and Mark had left deep emotional scars. As I walked out of the courtroom, I heard my mother's voice behind me. "Lucas, wait." I turned around, bracing myself. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her expression was still one of stubbornness. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said quietly. "It didn't have to," I replied, my voice steady but full of sadness. "You chose Mark over me, Mom. You let him try to take what was never his." She reached out, as if to touch my arm, but I took a step back. "Lucas, I thought I was doing what was best. I never wanted it to come to this." I shook my head slowly. "What's best for you, or for me? Because I don't think you ever really considered what I wanted." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm still your mother." "I know," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "But right now, I have to protect myself." Mark stood a few steps behind her, his expression hard and unforgiving. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "This isn't over." "It is for me," I shot back. "And it's over for the law, too." As I left the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I was relieved to have won, but I was also mourning the final blow to what was left of my relationship with my mother. It felt like a permanent fracture, one that might never heal. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone, but I also felt a sense of pride. I had fought for what was rightfully mine, and I had won. I knew my father would have been proud too. The morning after the court ruling, I woke up to a strange feeling, one of quiet triumph, but also a heavy, hollow sense of loss. I looked around my childhood bedroom, the only place that still felt familiar, and realized that the house was truly mine now. No more threats from Mark, no more manipulative attempts from my mother. Just me and the echoes of what had been. A few days later, I heard the sound of boxes being dragged across the floor. I peeked out of my window to see Mark and my mother hauling their things into a moving van. Their departure wasn't filled with angry shouts or dramatic farewells. It was silent, almost eerie. I felt a weird sense of closure, as I watched them drive away. They didn't look back, and neither did I. I had expected to feel victorious, even a little vindicated, but what I felt was emptiness. For the first time, I was truly alone. The house, once bustling with memories of family dinners, laughter, and the warmth of my father, now felt like a hollow shell. I could still see my mother's faint smile in the hallway mirror, still hear Mark's voice imposing new rules, still feel the lingering presence of Mark's children in what had been my father's study. I tried to busy myself with the task of reclaiming the house. The first thing I did was get rid of all the furniture that Mark had added. The cheap modern couch, the mismatched kitchen chairs, the impersonal artwork he'd insisted on hanging. All of it went. I hired a moving company to take everything away, replacing it with pieces that felt more like home. The old dining table my father had built, the armchair where he used to read, and family photos that had been tucked away during the chaos. As I rearranged the living room, a wave of bittersweet nostalgia hit me. I found an old photo of me and my father fishing by a lake when I was about 10. I sat on the floor, staring at the picture, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. I realized I was no longer fighting for just a house, but for the memory of my father, for the sense of stability he had tried to provide, and for the person I was before everything went wrong. But the reality of my isolation became more apparent as the days turned into weeks. The silence was comforting at first, but it also amplified my loneliness. I missed having a family, even a flawed one. The occasional text from my mother felt like daggers, short attempts to rebuild a connection I wasn't ready to revisit. Messages like, "How are you?" or "Thinking of you" were sent without acknowledgement on my part. I knew she was trying, but the wounds were still too fresh. One evening, she called. It was the first call she'd made since the court decision, and for reasons I didn't fully understand, I answered. "Lucas." Her voice was hesitant, unsure. "Yes," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she started, her voice breaking. "But I want you to know that I never wanted it to end like this." I felt a surge of mixed emotions. Anger, sadness, a tinge of sympathy. "Then why did you let it?" I asked quietly. "Why did you let Mark come between us?" Her silence on the other end was deafening. When she finally spoke, her words were filled with regret. "I was scared. After your father died, I felt so lost. Mark seemed like a lifeline, but I let things get out of control. I was wrong." I took a deep breath, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to accept her apology, to let the past be the past, but another part of me was still hurt, still angry. "I need time," I finally said. "I can't just forget everything that happened." "I understand," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But please know that I still love you, Lucas. I always will." We ended the call on a quiet note, and I felt a small measure of relief. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step toward closure. I couldn't fully cut her out of my life, not after everything, but I needed to keep my distance for my own sanity. Over the following weeks, I settled into a routine. I focused on my job, reconnecting with a few old friends who had drifted away during the drama. I even started seeing a therapist, hoping to process the tangled emotions that had accumulated over the years. Slowly, the house began to feel like home again. It wasn't just a reminder of my father's legacy anymore. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could rebuild myself without interference. But I was also learning a difficult lesson. That love doesn't always win. That family can break you as much as it can save you. And that sometimes the only way to find peace is to walk away from the people you once loved. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to fully forgive my mother, but I knew that for the first time in years, I was in control of my own life. The house, now filled with memories of both pain and perseverance, was proof of that. It wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of everything I had fought to keep and everything I was still learning to let go of. In the months that followed Mark and my mother's departure, the silence of the house shifted from being unsettling to almost comforting. It became a blank canvas where I could start anew, though the weight of the past lingered in every room. I still found myself wrestling with a mix of anger and sadness whenever I thought about my mother's betrayal. But for the first time, I felt like I had room to breathe. I took a part-time job at a local bookstore to support myself while attending college. Balancing work and studies wasn't easy, but it was the kind of struggle I welcomed. It was my struggle, no longer tainted by family drama or manipulation. I was carving out my own path, learning what it meant to be independent, both financially and emotionally. The house, once filled with tense arguments and heavy silences, slowly began to feel like a home again. I spent weekends painting the walls, choosing bright colors to replace the drab shades that Mark had chosen. I rearranged the furniture, giving the place a fresh start that mirrored my own. I even started tending to the garden, something my father used to do. It became a small ritual for me, an act of remembering but also of moving forward. Each flower I planted felt like a promise to myself that I was still here, still fighting, still growing. Therapy became an essential part of my journey. I initially resisted the idea, not wanting to revisit all the painful memories, but I knew deep down that I needed help to truly let go of the past. My therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, helped me unpack years of bottled-up emotions. It's okay to be angry, she often reminded me, but it's also okay to find peace. One session stood out to me more than others. Dr. Patel asked, "If your father were here, what do you think he'd say about everything you've gone through?" I thought about it for a while, then replied, "He'd probably tell me to focus on what I can control and to let go of the rest." It felt like a cliché answer, but it was also the truth. My father had always been the calm, steady presence in my life, and I realized that I was trying to channel that same strength now. But the anger toward my mother wasn't as easy to shake. I kept replaying our last confrontation in my mind, wondering if I'd been too harsh or if I'd done the right thing by cutting her off. Some days, I felt a pang of guilt for not trying harder to rebuild our relationship. Other days, I felt justified in keeping her at arm's length. I was torn between the boy who still craved his mother's love and the young man who needed to protect himself from further harm. The loneliness was something I hadn't anticipated. I'd fought so hard to claim the house, but now I found myself feeling isolated within its walls. There were moments when I missed the chaotic noise of a full house, even if it had been filled with conflict. I started to wonder if this solitude was the price of independence, or if it was just a phase I had to endure before finding a true sense of belonging. I began reaching out to friends I hadn't seen in years, hoping to reconnect and rebuild some kind of social life. Some were happy to hear from me, while others had moved on, their lives filled with new relationships and experiences. It was a humbling reminder of how much time had passed and how much I had missed while dealing with family drama. Then, one afternoon, I received a letter from my mother. It wasn't the first one she'd sent, but it was the first I felt compelled to open. Her handwriting was shaky, and the letter was short. "Lucas, I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for. I was blinded by my own fears and mistakes. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I love you and always will. I hope one day we can talk, even if it's just to understand each other better. Love, Mom." Reading those words stirred something deep inside me. I couldn't tell if it was anger, sadness, or the faintest hint of hope. I folded the letter and put it away in a drawer, unsure of what to do with it. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I also couldn't deny that a part of me longed for reconciliation. In the meantime, I kept pushing forward. College was challenging but rewarding, and I found solace in my studies. The courses felt like a gateway to a new life, one where I could define myself without the burden of my family's expectations. I started exploring subjects that interested me, like psychology and literature, and for the first time, I felt excited about the future. But the struggle for identity wasn't limited to academics or career choices. It was about learning who I was beneath the layers of resentment and survival mode I'd been living in for years. It was about finding out what I wanted, not just what I'd been forced to defend. One evening, as I sat on the porch my father had built, watching the sun set over the yard, I felt a sense of clarity. The house wasn't just a place to live. It was a reflection of everything I'd fought for. It was both a reminder of the pain and a testament to my resilience. And while I wasn't entirely sure who I was becoming, I knew that I was finally living on my own terms. The journey wasn't over, and the struggle for identity wasn't complete. But I was no longer defined by what I'd lost. I was defined by what I was building. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon when I heard a hesitant knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening it. When I did, I was greeted by a familiar but changed face, my mother. She stood there, looking smaller than I remembered, as if the weight of the past few years had physically diminished her. I could see a mix of guilt and vulnerability in her eyes, a look I'd never seen before. "Hi, Lucas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" I was torn. Part of me wanted to slam the door shut, to protect the hard-won peace I had built. But another part of me, a deeper, more compassionate part, wanted to know what she had to say. After a moment's hesitation, I stepped aside, allowing her into the house that used to be ours but had become solely mine. She looked around the living room, her eyes lingering on the familiar furniture and the family photos that still adorned the walls. "It looks like it used to," she said softly, almost wistfully. I didn't respond. I simply gestured for her to sit on the worn-out sofa. She sat down slowly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if trying to keep herself from falling apart. "Lucas, I know I don't deserve your time," she began, her voice trembling. "But I need you to know how sorry I am. I've made so many mistakes, and I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for." I leaned against the wall, keeping a safe distance. Her words didn't immediately break through the wall I'd built around my heart, but I could see the sincerity in her eyes. "I was scared," she continued, her voice cracking. "Scared of losing everything after your father died. When Mark came along, I was desperate for stability, for something to hold on to. But I realize now that I chose the wrong things, Lucas. I chose to prioritize Mark and his demands, and I neglected you. I never meant for things to go this far." It was strange to hear her speak so candidly, without the defensive edge that had been there during our last encounters. I could sense that she was truly trying to connect with me, to offer an explanation rather than an excuse. "I know I've hurt you," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "But I never stopped loving you. You're my son, and I'm so ashamed of how I let things get to this point." I felt a mixture of emotions: anger, sadness, even a bit of relief. This was the apology I had needed for so long, yet it felt both comforting and painful. The wounds were too deep to heal overnight, but her words were a start. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now," I admitted, my voice steady but strained. "You put me through hell, Mom. You made me feel like I wasn't worth fighting for, like everything Dad left behind didn't matter." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, and I regret it more than you can imagine. I just hope that someday you'll be able to find it in your heart to forgive me." We sat in heavy silence for a moment, the weight of the past filling the room. I didn't have the energy to argue or rehash every painful memory. I was too tired, and so was she. But I also knew that I couldn't carry this resentment forever. It was eating away at me, just as much as it had affected her. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you," I repeated. "But I'm willing to try and rebuild something, if we both put in the effort." Her eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Lucas," she whispered. "That's more than I could have asked for." The rest of our conversation was tentative and awkward. We talked about the small things, how I was doing in school, her new job at a local bakery, and even some memories of Dad that felt bittersweet to revisit. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. As she left, she turned to me one last time. "I hope we can keep talking, Lucas. I know it will take time, but I want to earn back your trust." I nodded. "We'll see," I said honestly, "but I'm open to trying." As the door closed behind her, I felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. I had no idea what the future held for us, but for the first time, there was a possibility, however faint, that we could mend the broken pieces of our relationship. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen quickly, but maybe, just maybe, it was possible. I wake up every morning to the quiet creaks and familiar sense of the house that has both haunted and healed me. The walls, once filled with painful memories, now feel more like a sanctuary. I've spent the last few months restoring each room to its original state, honoring my father's legacy. The house is no longer just a remnant of my past. It's the foundation of my present and the canvas for my future. My days have settled into a rhythm. I focus on school, work, and the friendships I've built over the last year. I even started planting a small garden in the backyard, something my father and I used to do together. It's a simple activity, but it reminds me of the quiet joy he always found in the little things. It's a slow process, but it feels like I'm finally growing roots of my own. The relationship with my mother remains fragile. After her unexpected visit, we've kept in touch sporadically, mainly through short calls and occasional texts. I'm still wary, still cautious, but I sense that her remorse is genuine. I know that rebuilding trust takes time, and I'm willing to give it a chance, if only to free myself from the anger that has lingered for so long. Mark, however, is a different story. I've heard from mutual acquaintances that he and my mother's new family are struggling financially. It's hard not to feel a bit of vindication, but I know holding on to that bitterness won't help me. I made the choice to protect my father's home, not to exact revenge. And now, with the legal battles behind me, I no longer feel the need to engage in their lives. One unexpected shift has been my growing sense of independence. I've learned how to manage bills, balance a budget, and handle the responsibilities that come with living alone. It's daunting at times, but I've come to appreciate the solitude. I never imagined I'd feel this comfortable on my own, but it's given me a sense of freedom I never had before. Therapy has also been a huge part of my journey. It's helped me confront the resentment I've held onto for years, the feeling of abandonment from my mother, the loss of my father, and the struggle to assert my own identity amidst all the chaos. I've learned to set boundaries, not just with others, but also with myself. I can't erase the past, but I can choose how to move forward. I've also started letting a few new people into my life. It's been slow and tentative, but it feels good to share my story with others who understand. I've joined a local support group for young adults who've faced family estrangement, and hearing similar experiences has been both comforting and eye-opening. It's made me realize that I'm not alone in this journey, that there are others out there fighting to redefine what family means. Today, as I sit on the porch my father built, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise over the familiar trees, I feel a sense of peace. The scars of the past are still there, but they don't define me anymore. The battles I've fought, both in court and within myself, have shaped me into someone stronger, someone who knows his worth. I don't know what the future holds for me or my relationship with my mother. We might find a way to rebuild, or we might drift apart permanently. But I've come to accept that some things are beyond my control. What I do know is that I've finally reclaimed my life, my home, and my sense of self. This house, once a battleground, has become a symbol of my resilience. It's a place where I can honor my father's memory while also creating new memories of my own. I've learned that family isn't just about blood or shared history. It's about love, respect, and the choices we make every day. And today, I choose to move forward, one step at a time,